Muted. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel. We're going to wait a minute for a few more people to join us, but we will be discussing today narrative strategy and how to actually translate that into real live campaigns, a very exciting topic. Today's event is an all Zoom, all virtual event. So you have the power to mute and unmute yourself. I encourage you to mute yourself. And maybe our tech can help us, tech support can help us mute others if they cannot mute themselves. Unlike other events here at Housing California, we are not a webinar, so you don't come in automatically muted. But that also gives us a lot of liberty to have robust conversation and to use the Zoom chat and other functionalities that are not available to us in our webinar to be engaging in this conversation, which we're really excited about. So I hope you all have had a great time at the conference. I've been able to join mostly virtually, so this doesn't feel new to me. And there's been some really compelling and interesting conversations happening and really lifting up the urgency of how we are solving, not just limiting homelessness, not just trying to, get a few more people in affordable housing, not just hoping it's not going to get worse, but really solving the problems that our state faces in terms of homelessness, affordability, or housing affordability and homelessness. And narrative is a key component to how we are going to get to those big, bold solutions that we've been talking about at the conference this week. My name is Jennifer Martinez. I'm going to facilitate today's discussion. I'm from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and I oversee our policy and advocacy grant making with our housing affordability team. Prior to this role, I was a community organizer for 20 years, an advocate around tenant rights and housing justice, and a learner in the arena of narrative work and how to do narrative work in the context of my advocacy and organizing. So that's what we're going to discuss here today. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So we will do a little bit of housekeeping, which I've already started us on. Then we're going to talk about what is narrative and why is it important. We will have amazing panelists who are going to present 3 case studies to us about how they have translated this big idea of narrative into their everyday work. We'll get an opportunity to ask some questions. Close out the panel. So as I was saying, go ahead and turn your sound off unless you're going to be in these small group discussions. If you can, join us by video. Love to see your lovely faces and feel the energy of being with other people, even if not in the same room. Feel free to submit your questions as we go along during this panel via the chat box. We will be collecting those questions, trying to synthesize them if there are similar questions, and we might not be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And then we will be able to use the breakout room functionality, which I will get to. I just got muted again, which we will get to when that time comes. Go ahead and move to the next slide. Next slide. Maybe Mike's not there. There we go. Okay. So here we are for the topic at hand, narrative. So this is a visual image that comes from the Narrative Initiatives and Grassroots Policy Project and the Perception Institute, who have done a lot of work on this area. And they characterize, they kind of place narrative in this larger set of tactics and strategies and just ways in which we live in the world, where we have at a deep, deep level our core values and worldview that each of us hold both as individually, as communities, and as cultures. Then we have a narrative that kind of binds all of those things together and translates those things into common sense common sense stories and common sense messages that we may be really familiar with. Now, this can get really muddled because on one hand, as an organizer and an advocate, I was always like, great, just give me the message. Like, what's the 5 words I need to say? And I'll say those things and I'll put them on every flyer and I'll put them on the website. I thought that's what narrative was. And maybe you were like me and you thought that's what narrative was, or that is what narrative, or is what narrative is. And it's not. It's bigger than that. It's more of a frame in which we're operating, and we're then using stories and messages to illustrate and enliven. So go to the next slide. So to toggle down a bit deeper, narrative is about retelling and reminding us who we are, how we got here, and what needs to be done to shape our future. The poet Lucille Clifton says, we cannot create what we cannot imagine. Narrative is a thing that gives us the imagination for what is possible in the world, or limits our imagination for what's possible. And so narrative kind of creates the playing field, if you will, for what we create. And so we want to use narrative as a way of building broad support for the solutions that we are looking for in terms of solving our housing crisis in California, and in activating people to become participants and feel the agency of being able to participate in solving and creating solutions to that problem. Next slide. So this requires narrative shift, because the stories we've been told about housing, who it's for, how it gets created, who's deserving of it, all is built on a narrative and a worldview that does not align with core values that we think are going to actually solve our crisis. And so housing justice we know that housing justice requires long-term investment. We also know that residents hold competing values. You know, on one hand, they say, yes, we want more affordable housing. On the other hand, they say, but not in my backyard. Or they say, yes, we need more homelessness services, but I don't want to pay for it. They're holding these competing values that we have to be able to break through with the new stories we tell. We also need to then invite them to become champions. So a narrative will help them be able to speak with their own voice, but in the frame that we help create for them. Which changes mindsets, changes people's views of the world and what's possible. Next slide. So the panel that we're going to hear from today really has done some significant work on how do we shift from existing ideas to and narratives to new narratives. And so these are some examples of that. I'll just pick a couple of them. There are probably many others that are come to mind when you think about what are some of the traditional narratives and stories that we tell about housing. We think about rugged individualism. People should be able to buy their own house, and that's what helps, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, versus this is a shared community benefit for everybody. It's a social good. We think about the ways in which people believe whether or not change is possible. The conversation that often is happening in our communities is like, we've tried that before, we can't, it's never going to work. And what we need is to shift people into believing that collective action can actually achieve our solutions. Next slide. So this is just a couple examples of what we're seeing even just recently. These all came out in the past few months out of media. This is not to, you know, to throw shade on our reporters and editors and those who create those headlines, but this is a very common way in which narrative is translated in and becomes part of our society through these kinds of headlines. And these are not the headlines that are going to help us create a new narrative for the solutions we seek. Next slide. So the goals for today's panel are to help us actually take this very high kind of like meta understanding of, you know, ideas and stories and turn it into something practical. We're going to be able to listen to current examples of advocates who are using narrative practices and strategies in their day-to-day work. Most of these lessons are going to be coming from the Bay Area. And It is part of, go ahead and go to the next slide, a cohort of organizations that has been organized by Nonprofit Housing in Northern California, along with 18 other organizations that they've been working now together for over 2 years, I think, almost 3 years now, to develop a playbook. This is a song book, if you will, where everyone might be singing different notes, playing different instruments, but we're all kind of playing with the same baseline music that is informing how we communicate, how we project out a new narrative for housing justice. So we want to just give you a little taste of what that experience in the Bay Area has been like, recognizing that there may be things here that are going to sound familiar and maybe relevant to your local context, and there's maybe some things that are not as familiar or relevant. This is just one example of how it can happen in other parts of the state. So if you can play the video to give us a little taste of that.
We love the Bay Area.
Diverse communities,
Beautiful surroundings,
vivid history, innovation and industry,
incredible art, culture,
food, and more.
but everything we love about the Bay Area is at risk. It's becoming harder and harder for people to find a decent place to live.
These are families, students, working people, our friends and neighbors, and they are being displaced from the homes they love.
This didn't happen by accident, and it doesn't have to be this way.
To build the future we deserve, we have to acknowledge how we got here.
Generations of exclusionary policies and institutional racism have created an unjust housing system which falls hardest on communities of color. We must change course.
For the sake of the people and businesses who make their homes here, and for the next generation of Bay Area residents.
We need to be bold enough,
Courageous enough,
ambitious enough to embrace the cause of housing justice for all.
Housing justice is about dismantling the structural challenges that harm our communities and hold the Bay Area back.
Housing justice is about spending less energy struggling to find a decent home to rent or buy, and more energy caring for our families.
Putting our entrepreneurial spirit into action and supporting thriving neighborhoods. It's about protecting and celebrating everything we love about the Bay Area.
Residents, community leaders, and policymakers all have a role to play. Creating change begins by shifting the ways we think and talk about housing. What kind of community do we want to be? Who does housing policy serve in our community? And who gets to decide?
What could the Bay Area be like if everyday people, workers, parents, and elders, Black and brown people, Indigenous and white neighbors, could afford a quality place to live in a community they love?
Local leaders, national experts, activists, and residents have come together to drive this change. We have developed a research-led and field-tested playbook to drive that shift among residents, community leaders, and policymakers. We need you to help put those resources into action. It starts by naming the moment we are in.
We all deserve a decent place to live. That's a matter of basic justice of who we are as a community.
Housing is essential, just like food, healthcare, and in education.
Housing justice is connected to the values our community shares. Diversity has always been a part of what makes the Bay Area special, vibrant, and successful.
People from every background are joined together to forge communities. The diversity of restaurants, parks, and outdoor activities,
Cultures, art, neighborhoods is what makes the Bay Area like nowhere else in our nation. It's up to us to protect that legacy.
It's up to us to build the future our children deserve. It's up to us to move the Bay Area forward.
Creating a real shift in how we think about solutions means being honest about the root causes of the problems we face. It means taking on the way that bigotry, racism, and inequity are baked into the structure of how housing is developed and delivered in our communities.
Promoting equity and challenging injustice is never easy. The good news is,
You are not alone in this work. Housing justice is a top priority in our community. We see residents and small businesses being displaced all over the Bay Area, and we know that once they're gone, they may never come back. Now, we need to make housing justice a priority for businesses, community organizations, and government/lawmakers.
If we don't start to make changes now, we'll lose the diversity, vibrancy, and strong community that makes this place so special. Those changes are within our reach. The Bay Area has an incredible record of innovation and problem solving.
We can lead the way to a future where people have stable homes and are free to pursue their dreams, raise their families, and build the lives they want to live.
Those solutions will have enormous impacts. Having a safe, stable place to call home, improve our health, and connects us to vital resources. Investing in diverse housing solutions helps us address issues like hunger, drug addiction, growing poverty and homelessness among seniors, the pandemic response, and the rising call for racial justice.
Many of us who grew up here or came here seeking a better life have been able to build something meaningful. Let's not close that door of opportunity for our neighbors who are struggling. Let's not slam it shut to the next generation of Bay Area residents.
The challenges facing the Bay Area didn't rise up overnight. You've seen it, and you've lived it. Racist policies and inequitable systems that fall hardest on communities of color have built up over decades.
But the values that will shape the future of the Bay Area aren't new either.
They have deep roots in our community,
Celebrating diverse communities,
welcoming new ideas,
embracing innovation,
adapting to a changing world. Most of all, working together to build the kind of future that our children deserve, right here in the place we love.
These are the values that live in every neighborhood in the Bay Area. Together, we will connect these values to the cause of housing justice.
We will mobilize our community to demand the future they deserve. We will shape a movement founded on equity, driven by compassion, and dedicated to ensuring that all of our neighbors have a safe, affordable, decent home.
Add your voice and your power to this growing movement. Get started now by exploring the full set of resources. Will you join in?
Great. So that is the context in which our speakers will be taking some of those core ideas and translating them into everyday work. And I'll just say one thing before I hand it over to the panelists, which is that a lot of what you saw in that video comes from deep research, experimentation, testing by the organizations that are participating in this coalition, and are, comes from an actual trial and error, if you will, of what is working and what didn't work in their context. And so that is partly how this was developed. So with no further ado, I will hand it over to our panelists, and let me introduce our first panelist, Monet Boyd. Monet comes to us from the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, BAR High, and leads the Black Housing Advisory Task Force, which is securing funding and partnerships for the regional Black housing program. She's a project manager for the Black Infant Health and Perinatal Equity Initiative, a collective of the Bay Area public health departments, which is looking to reduce the impact of racism on Black birthing people. Monet is also assisting with the creation of the Vallejo Community Land Trust. She recently graduated from California Polytechnic State University with a degree in urban and regional planning, in a minor in African American Studies. She's worked for the San Francisco Foundation, interned for the city of El Cerrito, and has done many other amazing things that brings her to us today. Monet, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. So glad to be here and speaking with you all today. We can go to the next slide. So the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, also known as BAR-HI, is the coalition of the Bay Area's governmental public health departments, founded to work on issues of health outside the doctor's office. We are focused on changing public health practice through working with public health employees and addressing issues such as climate impacts, environmental justice, housing, and racial equity. We've been working intently on housing issues for a number of years. A few years ago, in 2018, we partnered with the Federal Reserve on some original research, which showed housing affordability is a central issue for health region-wide, and not just in the 3 big cities. And that is particularly acute for people of color, especially Black residents, because of the compounding impacts of decades of discrimination, unequal access to wealth, and all the things that you all have seen in the video. But this study came our path to the regional Black housing agenda. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So just to tell you all about our campaign, we created a regional strategy for the Bay Area with a group called the Bay Area Black Housing Advisory Task Force. And it is a coalition of over 40 Black-led organizations dedicated to serving the health and well-being of the Bay Area's Black communities with expertise with folks in the housing field, when development, finance, economic development, and also wraparound services and homeless services. And so together, the members of Black Hat have created this strategy from the work that they've seen. And so the strategy, it has 2 parts. So part 1 is to establish a regional Black housing funding pool funded principally by the state with the contributions from each county. And we envision this as a $500 million funding pool to achieve a virtuous cycle of development. The fund will invest in 3 interrelated categories. So 1 being project development, to increase housing access for Black families and support Black-led developers to bring brick and mortar projects to fruition. But this also goes into Black home ownership opportunities, also asset retention, and working with folks on homelessness solutions. And the second piece, organizational capacity building, to strengthen the ability of Black-led organizations to deliver projects and services. We know that a lot of Black-led organizations are usually have a smaller staff or emerging. So we want to allow this funding pool to give them grants and subsidies so that they can continue to grow and serve in the way that they want to and need to. And the third piece being community planning, to envision future projects, especially in parts of the region that are experiencing a growing Black population. So a big piece of our regional strategy and where it comes from is that a lot of Black folks have been pushed out to places such as Antioch, Brentwood, Pittsburgh, Stockton, from the places that we have been used to seeing, such as San Francisco, Berkeley, and Oakland. And so there hasn't been the same amount of infrastructure for this growing population and moving to that side of our region. And part 2 is fostering government investment in a set of great local projects that are being driven forward by Black leaders to help serve the housing needs of the Black community. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just when we first started our campaigning and working, we're very much still in the thick of it and learning and growing and evolving our campaign. But we knew that we had to speak to lawmakers, policymakers to get this $500 million request in the budget. And we've been talking to Board of Supervisors, legislatures, folks in the Newsom administration, local electeds, legislative staff, housing organizations, and community-based organizations of all kinds. And we were not receiving the reaction that we wanted when it came to the campaign. And it was mainly because I was not a part of the Shift the Narrative processes for the whole 3 years that it's been going on. I joined a little bit later. And so a lot of it, we felt like, okay, this is the solution. We need Black-led solutions. People understand where this is coming from, the struggle of Black folks and the plight, but people didn't see it as their problem. They didn't see it as a whole situation for the Bay Area and they didn't understand their stake in it. Next slide, please. And so our case making was very brief in our letter, and we just went into the solution, and this is the things that we want to offer, as I mentioned. And we just pretty much laid it that it was a $500 million request, mainly funded by the state. And but we needed to create the case. And I joined Shift the Narrative around that time, where they helped me to understand how to help people understand their stake in our work, as well as for people to see the intention behind the work that we're trying to do to create a model, not only for the Black Bay Area, but for others that are also being pushed out of the Bay Area. Next slide, please. So after this is our statement after the case making with Shift the Narrative. As you see, it got much longer and more statistics in it as well. And so in this strategy, we put in not only that the Bay Area, the whole Bay Area is going through a housing crisis. We wanted to acknowledge the fact that we're all going through it. But we also wanted to say that
Monet, there you're back out. Thank you.
Thank you. The state that we're in, and the state that we're in at the moment is that Black communities have been stripped for generations of access to wealth, prosperity, because of the things mentioned even in that video, exclusionary practices, displacement, and then also this has resulted in Black families only having a net worth of $24,000 compared to white families having $188,000 based on Federal Reserve data. And so it's such a stark difference because of this wealth gap and the history of redlining and predatory lending and all the things. So we were able to get people into state, I guess, place them where how we got to this situation. And then also naming the moment, and that in 2020 we had a huge racial reckoning, and also showed folks all the things that have been going on in the Bay Area. And then also COVID exacerbated the issues that Black folks have already been going through. And so we were able to help people understand that it's a moment that we're in to change the trajectory of the Black Bay Area, and that Black-centered solutions can not only serve as a model of what can happen in the Bay Area, but other solutions for other communities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some of the lessons that we implemented from the Shift the Narrative practice and still implementing is to name the power of this moment for the Black Bay Area. So again, saying, letting people know about the 2020 racial reckoning, all of the funds that have come down from our state and government for housing money and all those things, so people can see that this is a time to change the trajectory of how we've treated Black folks, how we can change wealth, and how we can work with Black developers to create Black-led solutions with community. And creating a narrative that all people can relate to and understand, that people can understand their stake, especially with policy and lawmakers, and helping and showing them what they can do for their residents. And then tailoring the narrative and messaging to each group or individual. We talked to so many different people about this campaign because it's not a little bit amount of money. It's a big amount of money. So we needed a lot of folks to buy into this strategy and to understand why it needs to happen, and why Black homeownership and why it matters to have to allow Black folks to continue their legacy in the Bay Area. And then continue to present data that reinforces our message. And we created more background, more data, and then also how the money will be spent and created. And then always helping people to understand their stake in the issue. And also helping folks to understand that there are no extra people in the Bay Area, and that we're not trying to, that it's not better to push people out, or always I think a lot of people are always thinking that it's better for the housing to for people to be pushed out or moved to other places because the Bay Area is being so crowded. But we have to show people that that there's no extra folks here, that everyone has a stake here and has their community here and has their support system here. And making sure that your narrative in the beginning already answers their questions in advance. So there's more to the narrative. Folks want to read our full letter and our request, but to help people understand that, again, that this is a model for more than just the Black community, but we're starting off with that so that we can help others and start the pathway. Next slide. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Please, as you are starting to think, listen and think of questions you might want to ask, please start adding them to the chat, and we will be collecting them as the conversation proceeds. So our moving to our next panelist, and if you were paying very close attention to your agenda for today's panel, you might have been expecting to see Anya Spano from the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, or otherwise known as ACE, presenting here today on the amazing work that they are doing. But owing to an unexpected emergency, we're actually going to be hearing from Alina Harway, who will be speaking on the work that ACE has done. So we're not going to miss the great work of ACE. Alina is the communications director at Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. She has been leading strategic communications not only for NPH, but also anchoring the regional Shift the Bay initiative from which this panel has emerged. She's been working closely with table members and other interested parties who want to also embrace and adopt and utilize a narrative in order to address housing justice in the region. And Alina is going to be presenting ACE's work that has emerged out of this table. Thanks, Lena.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. And I want to start this case study by just recognizing that in my role at NPH as the anchor organization for the Shift the Bay initiative, I've really had this unique opportunity to see and learn and hear directly from our table members, as well as Jennifer mentioned, a whole number of organizations in the narrative ecosystem, as folks have been digging into the research and the message recommendations and advancing that through their campaigns. And specifically for today's case study, and you can actually go ahead and go to the next slide for this, there were a number of our table members who were engaging in connected yet distinct elements of the eviction protections and rent relief work that was happening in the narrative space. So just want to start out by saying I'm really glad to be able to pitch in today and help still be able to offer these highlights from ACE's work, but want to flag that as you're learning about this, I won't be able to answer questions about the internal campaign development, but I would, given my perspective, invite you to think about, as we explore this case study, two things. One, what does it look like to embed long-term narrative strategy across specific time-bound bills? Because I think that sort of brings that like abstract narrative strategy high level into the what does this look like in practice? This is a great case study for that. And then also to think as you're looking at the coalition and movement space around you, what does it look like in practice to be utilizing shared centralized messages and narrative goals, even as you're executing through decentralized campaigns, which is a model for the Shift the Bay initiative. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So in short, what we're talking about today is ACE's case study, with big shout out and gratitude to Anya for having taken this all the way to the near finish line before having to tend with some other things. This case study was designed to help us unpack what it looks like to apply narrative strategy to tenant protections at large, because of course ACE was and continues to be working really specific bills, policy action items from eviction protections to new tenant protection policies and rental relief. They really saw the opportunity and need to create a broader narrative as the foundation for each of those campaigns. So not running a separate campaign for each one, but really looking at how are we going to win our specific bills and campaigns while building off one coherent narrative. Making the case for how we can create that meaningful change right now because we need it, but also seeding that ability to shift the dialogue around why and how we protect and value our community's renters. Next slide. So we're going to start with a piece of creative, but before we hit play, I want to set the stage for you. I need you all to go with me back in a time machine for a moment, go back to earlier in the pandemic and thinking about how we were talking about what we needed to do. You may recall that Governor Newsom especially, and a lot of people and a lot of lawmakers were really out front in the news, on Twitter, touting the need and the power of the mask. Of course, I don't think anyone disagrees that masks were and are an important and powerful tool in response to COVID, but think about what role was that conversation going to play in feeding and cementing what people thought about what was happening. And so before we hop into that video, just ask a question to you. What does it mean if we respond to COVID with masks as the answer? And just to think about that for a moment, and if you have a reaction or a thought and you're willing to pop it in the chat box just to get us sort of in community dialogue, what does it mean for our communities if the conversation, if the question is COVID and the answer is masks, what does that say? Let's go ahead and watch that video. We'll come back to this question. So as that's just wrapping up, I'd love to hear just any reactions. Like, what does this make you feel? What does this make you think? What does this make you wonder about? What does this make you want? Here's what I think. I look back at this, and when Anya showed me this video, it just gave me immediate goosebumps, and I had an immediate reaction, and it just reminded me that masks weren't a wrong answer, but they were the wrong conversation lead. Because what the answer masks means is individual action. Masks signify that the responsibility is on the individual, and masks as the topic lead suggests that there's a very specific technical problem with a very specific technical solution. This video, though, grabs our attention and forces us to confront that bigger picture question, to ask the bigger question and demand a bolder solution. It really calls on us to ask, what are we solving for and how? So we can go to the next slide. One thing I mentioned earlier is that a number of folks at our table and beyond were working on related yet distinct campaigns. And so for ACE, their target, given their statewide bill package and the way they were doing their work, their target was the governor. And so their campaign and their message looked different than, for example, Bar High, who you just heard from Monet on a different program, but Bar High was also working on some eviction moratorium work, as were a number of folks, and specifically last fall, preparing local cities with their own actions. What steps can local cities take should the statewide moratorium officially expire? So they had different campaign targets and they had different campaign tones, but there was agreement about a few common narrative needs, which led to a really important balance that you see show up in ACE's message. We need to demonstrate the power of this moment. We need to uplift the critical foundational role of housing. We need to hold lawmakers accountable. And yet, given what our narrative research shows, we need to make sure that in holding lawmakers accountable, we're not at the same time undermining trust in the ability of government to make change, because we know we have to partner with them, and we know that that's one of those risky narratives that can push people away from leaning into solutions. So while that video was certainly plenty specific to the governor, the larger effort and story from ACE, as you'll see as we go forward, it wasn't about the governor. The story wasn't about the governor, even as it targeted him. It was really about uplifting the human experience through real community voices. So there's 4 little snippets here, and of course the video before was one of their members, a community resident, but they worked with actually hundreds of community members, and they organized and trained and collected and shared their stories. Next slide, please. Those stories were shared in many different formats, but media was one of the critical outlets to be able to share those stories, as well as identified by the Shift the Bay initiative, the table working in partnership, as one of the most important audiences and channels we had to do narrative shift strategy at large. The reason for this, through our research, looking at what the dominant narratives were in the media and looking at the impact of that, it was really clear that media has such an outsized influence in how housing and racial justice conversations are framed, digested, discussed, and analyzed, and especially so with lawmakers and other decision makers. Next slide. So ACE's media strategy centered community voices and trained and supported them to, in their conversations with reporters and the work that they were leading, to try to really shape the conversation, moving it away from scarcity and fear towards justice, moving from individual responsibility and accountability to collective action and community benefit. You can see a couple of the media outcomes from this work here. And if you go to the next slide, here as well. If we go to the next slide, we're just going to see, you're going to hear me say next slide a lot because we're looking at a couple of the different news clips just to emphasize what the outcomes of this media strategy looks like. And you know, what this work was able to lead to. We were able to make progress both in the daily conversations and in the policy outcomes. Next slide. And so even while it's clear that there's more work to be done, keeping that drumbeat going about who, why, how. Next slide. And as with everything, not every article has a headline we love, just as not every campaign has the outcome we want. Next slide. But in recognition that concrete campaign work and narrative strategy have to work in tandem, because stepping stone wins are what build momentum for lasting change. Next slide. And so as we do this work to focus on changing the dialogue, it helps us change the outcomes, which then of course in turn helps us continue to change the dialogue, because what are we reporting on? What are we reading about? How are we talking about it? And this of course includes some of the latest wins, last week's Assembly Bill 2179. I know that Anya and ACE and so many of our partners and friends were working on that. So I just want to take a moment to celebrate that momentous win. And just a quick recap on this case study before handing it back to Jennifer. From my perspective, some of the important takeaways I want to uplift is looking at how ACE used narrative strategy to uplift the power of the moment while making sure that, you know, it wasn't just the message of the moment is now, that we were really thinking about how we didn't want to get focused on any one bill being the solution. So it's power of the moment. Tenant protections isn't just one bill, it's a bigger coherent narrative. We need to hold governments accountable, but don't do so at the expense of degrading trust in being able to partner with government. We need to center voices and uplift the foundational role of housing so that we are effectively calling the question, making people wonder and think and actually take a moment to say, what are we really solving for? And then media specifically as a critical tool that we can use to really support both short-term campaign outcomes, especially given its trusted role with policymakers, and our long-term goals, as media really shapes how voters and community members read, digest, and then themselves reinforce the conversations. So thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer here.
Great, thank you, Alina. Great pinch hitter as the baseball season gets started, and we're thinking about that. Well done for presenting that wonderful case study. And you know, what's really starting to come through for me in these different case studies that we've so far heard is just the need to pause and check some of the assumptions we have about how we're approaching our communications, and make sure those communications and those like bigger frames that we're trying to present aren't undermining us other values or goals that we might have as well, and alongside of those immediate urgencies and urgent campaigns. So that was really coming through in this case study, and in the first one as well. So with we have one more to present to you, and we will invite Corey Winter to share the case study coming from Hamilton Families. And Corey is a communications manager with Hamilton, whose mission is to end family homelessness in the San Francisco Bay Area. His work is strategic communications, narrative development, local community impact efforts, and working with families and youth. He's a graduate of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, also a graduate of SOAS University of London and the Idaho State University. Wow, a lot of degrees there, Corey. Welcome to our panel, and take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'm coming at this not necessarily from a housing advocacy organization, but actually as a direct service provider. Hamilton Families, as you mentioned, our mission is to end family homelessness, and we're a human service provider to families experiencing homelessness in actually the larger Greater Bay Area, having served about 800 families. last fiscal year. So if you want to check out our annual report, just go to our website. Got to do a little small plug there. Um, I, since we're talking about narrative shift, I thought I would take my presentation and tell you just a little story of our case study. If you want to go to the next slide. For the past if you want to go to the next slide, please.
Technical difficulties.
No worries. Well, while they're working on that,
sorry guys, give me 1 second. Our power just went out here. Give me 1 moment.
Oh,
I'll be right back.
Okay.
no worries. I can jump. Yeah. Is it okay if I just keep going? It's not
Yeah,
critical.
yeah. Go,
Awesome.
go forward as long as you feel comfortable. Yep.
No worries. So for the last 3 years, I've been working on a really human-centered awareness connections campaign to really take on a very kind of ambitious project. As you are all aware, homelessness has an incredibly negative narrative that's really something that we hit up hard against every single time we drive any sort of campaign, especially even if it's towards advocating for tenants' rights, affordable housing. Oh, awesome! There we go. This is just a tweet of mine about just announcing one of the products of our awareness campaign. So for the last 2 years, I've been working on this to really dismantle the narratives surrounding people experiencing homelessness and families experiencing homelessness, and how we have to confront that every single time we put anything out into the zeitgeist, that, and as that relates to affordable housing. We also serve as a bridge as a homelessness service provider to families experiencing homelessness, moving them into permanent housing. And we then take off our homelessness hat and put on our tenants' rights hats, and we advocate for affordable housing in order to permanently house the families that we are serving. So next slide. So back in 2019, the planets aligned and we got an amazing $1.35 million gift from Google.org and CEO of YouTube, Susan Wojcicki. It was a wonderful gift, and part of that went towards a media campaign. So what we did, and what you see right here is them making that announcement on our shelter rooftop in the Tenderloin. And what we did is we took a really kind of fun approach to it, where we created we wanted to really invoke connections to the families that we served, really centering the narrative, the overall narrative that we have at Hamilton Families, but really on the families themselves, treating the families as the experts in their own lives, showing that what their stories are our stories. And that is exactly, in order to uplift and stabilize these families, that is the entire point behind our work. So we wanted to dive deep into the stories behind these families, why they were experiencing homelessness, what actually is needed to be done in order to lift them out of that homelessness and break the cycle of poverty. So we created three documentary short films, each on a family that was experiencing homelessness in our programs, and really just detailing and showing the journey of their stability as they became permanently housed and became affordable housing owners, or renters, and tenants. And we partnered with the San Francisco studio, the Bay Area Video Coalition, BayVec Media. We created filmmaking teams that would have been following these families over like the next year, really just becoming a part of their lives, so that we could really just detail their family, their story over the course of the year, what kind of trials, tribulations, issues and problems, successes, obstacles that they would be facing, so we could really humanize that narrative. And then, if you want to go to the next slide, the pandemic happened, and we had to scrap everything. We it was March of 2020, and we really had to just toss the playbook out the window. It really just curtailed, or it just like derailed everything that we had planned up to that point. But rather than let that stop our campaign, all the work that we had set up, we if you want to go to the next slide, we decided to go virtual, organize everything over Zoom, as we all did in that time, as we are right now. We got iPhones to the families, and really we just encouraged them to document their lives. As you can see, Precious Saria, who's in the bottom right corner, she is the subject of one of our documentary films. And then Elizabeth Lowe above her is the director, and Daniel Chen is the other director of her film About a Home. And we got them iPhones, where we got the family's iPhones, and they were recording themselves, and we just provided virtual direction. If you want to go to the next slide. So that they were just recording their lives, and it was wonderful. The families shared with us that through this process, we were such a pivotal stabilizing force through their life, that they were able to, they felt a connection with the outside world, and we were able to provide encouragement and development with their families, and just really be that rock, that one of the few core elements at the time that really could have destabilized them, as they were stabilizing themselves through their experiences with homelessness and coming out of that. If you want to go to the next slide. Long story short, the result of these connections in this media awareness campaign are these three films. It's Hogar, a bilingual children's animated film that I'm incredibly proud of, and is incredibly powerful, and Pixar, eat your heart out. The next film, About a Home, it's a video diary compilation of a family who just recently entered into their very first home. They just stabilized them out of homelessness, and they are renters in the North Bay. It's incredibly powerful, just because it really it touches on right when sorry. Just please go ahead and watch it. I don't want to. I just realized I can't give anything away without giving a spoiler away. And what you'll remember, and I want to focus on this one a bit, just because this one is a love story from two parents to their children, and it's narrated by the mother and father, Liz and David. If you want to go to the next slide. This film it was rather close to me, because when I started working at Hamilton Families, I actually met Liz at our shelter. Her family had just recently entered into our shelter, and then we had been working on like a Prop A campaign that was in 2019, and I could just her story and mine just aligned so much when I met her. And I could just recognize the power and the potential behind her storytelling ability, and as you can see, it eventually became a New York Times op doc. So I'm incredibly proud of her storytelling ability. But the reason why why her story is so impactful to me is so. This was in the middle of the pandemic, and her filmmaking team, her director and her producer, woken up at like midnight, and they're like, Corey, we just sent you this raw footage that Liz had recorded for us and sent us. Please, you need to watch this right now. So I did. And I watch it, and it is just like, it's incredible. I thought they had just put it through the editing and just had, done their filmmaker magic on this. And I asked them, like, what editor did you get? And they're like, no, this was actually from Liz. This was actually her. This is her raw footage. And I'm like, this is incredible. And immediately they tell me that, we have to get her into filmmaking classes. She is such a raw talent. This is just, and this is from, this is a mom who had been experiencing homelessness for the last 15 years, had no filmmaking abilities whatsoever. So we call the executive director of BayVac, Paula Smith Aragoni. She's like, yeah, oh my God, we have to absolutely, this is just such an incredible raw talent that we really need to cultivate this. And now, if we want to go to the next slide, her film, What You Remember, has been just killing it in the festival film circuit. She is this incredibly incredible talent in her own storytelling ability. If we want to go to the next slide. And really now she is an emerging filmmaker, and we're so proud of her, and we want to utilize, like, her narrative and her storytelling ability is just one of like hundreds that we are serving here at Hamilton Families, and it has become part of our narrative. And as you can see, we're uplifting her to become a community advocate for families experiencing homelessness. If you want to go to the next slide. And it's being seen across the country. And this little highlighted example right here is just a sample of how we're incorporating Shift the Narrative messaging into this narrative. And yeah, I mean, if you'd like to see more, I really encourage you, if you want to go to the next slide, to see more of the families that we are serving and the stories that we're sharing on their behalf. And you can check more at this URL. But all that to be said, there's so many like lessons learned that we did learn from Shift the Bay, and it is the power of like values-based messaging, the power of using we, and really exercising that muscle. I'm sure that this is pretty fresh in our memories, Alina, but when Dr. T was giving us a refresh of the Shift the Bay, the Seize the Narrative playbook, that was one of the items that really we all found at the group to be something that we really need to practice working on, is really taking on that we-based messaging, that this is a community issue, that this is where we all have a stake in this problem, affordable housing, not just homelessness. But we also felt that we shared some lessons learned with the Shift the Bay group as well. It's that there's a way to tell stories without re-traumatizing tenants and residents and individuals experiencing homelessness. Really taking that approach and building trust with them so that they feel excited about the prospect of sharing their story and not reticent about it. They're not avoiding the issue, because they are who this is truly impacting. And if you can empower them and build that trust and really center your communication really from like a human-centered approach, and just like let's focus, yes, on the issue, but really on the individual and really on the family, and let's treat them as people. That is, I'll leave it there. I know I'm over time.
Thanks, Corey. So yeah, I'd love to get us all into the same view. Thank you. And invite our panelists and for a quick Q&A, and then we're going to go into some small groups for us to dig into more of what they are doing and discuss more of your questions in a small group format. So thank you so much to all of you for all the hard work you're doing, for the amazing creativity, for the leadership, for the way you're engaging people with lived experience and lifting up their voices and their stories. and transforming the conversation that we're having in the Bay Area around housing affordability, tenant rights, homelessness, and housing justice in general. So the one question I want to ask you before we then break into small groups and give our participants more time to discuss is if you could say, what is the difference between narrative and messaging that you have learned and been able to actually utilize in your day-to-day work? Like, give us something concrete for us to really understand so that we might go back to our day-to-day work and try it on as well. Like, what's one thing that you would say you have learned? And I'll let any of you jump in there for it.
I'd like to jump in here. Just because, again, Alina, this is still fresh in our memory. The seize the narrative. Shift the Bay has developed a seize the narrative playbook, and this is something that even 3 years into this, into our coalition here, we're still advising all the table members to adopt. Is that it's okay to like steal messaging from that playbook, because what these are is that this is tried and true tested focus group messaging that you can apply to your individual, the narratives that you're developing at your organizations, because it's more of like to me, messages are really the words that deliver the narrative, but narrative is really what has delivered the strategy that you've set in place. So what is your overall strategy first? What is the narrative that you're adopting to really push that strategy forward? But what are the messages? What are the words? What are the phrases that you're utilizing as part of that greater narrative?
So what I heard, maybe Corey, what you're saying is like the narrative is the strategy that carries on past one point in time, but is informing all the ways you communicate and do the work that you're doing. Is that what you're saying? Okay, great.
As you can see, like one of the in the I think it was the second to last slide that I gave, we incorporated actual messaging from that playbook into not just like the larger strategy, obviously, but the narrative that we were sharing about each one of the families that we were serving, about what it means to be a family experiencing homelessness, and what it means to help them stabilize and thrive, break this cycle of poverty, get them into affordable housing, the need for affordable housing. All of that is like largely wrapped up into what your narrative is, that you're trying to compose and promote for your given, whatever campaign it is that you might have. But yeah, that's, to me, the messages are just components of that larger narrative.
Great, thank you.
I'd like to add one more.
Go for it.
Oh, can I add one more thing to that, Jennifer? I think that for me, it's really, really important to return to what the research showed us that the dominant narratives are, because it's so easy to like be dismissive of like the narratives that we don't agree with. We're just like, oh gosh, that's so annoying. People are like, oh, you should just be able to pull yourself up from the bootstraps. Like when you referenced that earlier, I was like, oh, there's this really funny TikTok talking about how dumb that is to think that. Well, it's not helpful if I'm just like, it's dumb to think that. That's what people think. That's what we've been told. That's what we believe. That's what we feel. And so we actually have, we have a little cheat sheet about what our research showed us those dominant narratives were. I think that was, helped inform that slide you presented, Jennifer. But to go back to that all the time and be like, this is what the dominant narratives are. It's not dumb that people think this. It is not annoying that they think this. Start there. So when I'm reading an op-ed that I've drafted, or if I'm like trying to help someone make some talk points, I'm not thinking, what do I want to be saying? What do I want people to resonate with? I'm thinking through the lens of how is this going to land, given that they believe that if you work hard enough, given that they believe like, well, this was my experience and therefore. So I find that really important and really helpful to give me that lens to go back and get out of my own brain, because I'm not the base. I'm the communications director who thinks about things really differently than most people.
Thanks, Selena. And I'll go one further. And I don't want to out myself here, but in terms of others might feel like embarrassed to say this, but let's be honest, we all swim in the same waters. we are not immune from these stories, right? And so I even find myself slipping into them, even though my core values are different. I have been trained like everybody else. And so I have to check my own self and what I write or what I say or how I'm thinking about something against some of those dominant narratives too, because like you're not immune from the society you live in. And so, just, if that comes up in your small groups, it's okay to talk about it. How do we retrain our brains? That's what we're here for. Monet, can I draw you out on this question and just ask what you learned about the differences between narrative and messaging and in a practical way, how you're applying that?
Sure. I think for me, a lot of it, I use the playbook all the time. I'm always going back to it. I think, and even like Alina said, even when we're speaking to people, and I think I mentioned this too, is the making sure that the narrative already answers their questions. I think it's always this, the previous narratives that people have and hold is that we blame Black folks for a lot of what Black people are going through. And so, we've dealt with those conversations, and even homeless folks, we blame them, or saying like, folks want to be out here, so these are the things that we think. And so, like our society thinks. And so I think the playbook has taught us to not blame anyone or condemn anyone for the way we've been taught to think, but to put it on the system in our narrative, and to remember that we can change the system together if we do it thoughtfully and change the way people think. So I always try to put that in my narrative. And I feel like the messaging is just more so, like, I think Corey said it best, like it's just the words and the platforms of where we place it. But I think the narrative and that thread of the story is what I've been learning the most from shifting it.
Well, great. Well, I'm excited to invite us into some small groups in order to have deeper conversation about this. So we are going to open up into 4 small groups, and maybe we could post the slide that shares what those small groups are going to be, and get the small group, the Zoom groups open or available to be opened. So do we have a slide here? I can read it out too. So we're going to have 4 groups. One is going to be speaking about what movements need in order to advance narrative strategy, and I'll be in that small group. We're going to be talking about how to embed narrative strategy in the role and in your organization. Alina will be leading that small group. We're going to be talking about storytelling and how to do storytelling in a way that shapes your narrative. Corey will lead that small group. And then we're going to be talking, and then Monet is going to lead a conversation on how to design your campaigns to win using narrative strategy. So if any of those sound interesting to you, they are labeled in the breakout room, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. You just click on the breakout room and you can select which small group you'd like to go into. And we'll spend about 15 minutes in these small groups, and then we will return to the large group and send you on your way. So look forward to seeing you over there.
And I'll just offer, if anyone's having a hard time figuring out how to navigate into the breakout room, feel free to just shout out or drop a note in the chat box, and we can manually move you over.
Yeah, I'm having trouble getting in.
Can you name yourself and which room you want to get in? I'll help you out.
I'm the number 1. My name is Joe.
All right, Joe, I'm sending you to group number 1.
Thank you.
Anyone else having any issues moving over? Heck, Mike, can I leave these last unassigned folks in your hands?
Yes, of course.
Can you move me to group 3, please?
that Tony?
Yes.
You got it. All right.
Thank you.
Group 3. All right, Mike, I'm leaving everyone else with you. I'm going to head into my breakout room. See you in about
Sounds good.
15.
See you in 15.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had some good, productive conversations in your discussion in your small groups. I'll try to get us back to. And I see that we're coming back a small but mighty group. First of all, let me thank Mike for the technical support and losing power and still keeping on track. There's a lot of technical things going on in this conference that deserves some appreciation. So thanks, Mike. Appreciate you helping us get through this. There's another group. There's more people coming in. Okay, so yeah, so we're just going to wrap up and want to just see if there's any sort of last comments or thoughts that folks had coming out of those small groups. Feel free to unmute yourself. We've got a couple of minutes, and then we will send you on your way.
I'll share one takeaway from my group, which was talking about how to embed narrative strategy, actually in your day-to-day. And just one of the big takeaways was it still often sometimes feels like an afterthought, but we recognize that that's a step in the right direction because now it's a thought. And just being kind to ourselves, that if people didn't know what narrative strategy was 5 years ago, of course it's a journey. The same way we are looking at shifting values with external audiences is going to be slow and steady. Of course, if we're doing our work a different way as a movement, it's going to take time as well. And we should just keep marching in the direction we're going. And then specifically folks uplifted housing elements as a place to really, or other regional opportunities to really look at cross team collaboration, cross organization collaboration to really explore what does it look like to embed narrative at that scale. So I just really want to appreciate my small group for that conversation.
Great. Anyone else? Quick takeaways?
Yeah, a really big takeaway from our group during the storytelling breakout room is trying to really hard to avoid this doomsday narrative, and how you'll see this new meme culture that's taking advantage of the okay boomer memes is just being okay doomer, because it just seems like the world is going to hell and in a handbasket and we're all going along with it. And it's just no, why there are elements of optimism that we can approach with these narratives that does not all need to be this negatively reinforced narratives that we're just kind of adopting the same attitude, and it just seems well, we're fighting with fire. That does not seem to make sense.
Yeah, I learned as an organizer to just always pull the fire alarm, and there's always a fire thinking. And our assumption there was that we thought that's what would motivate people, get them feel urgency. But actually, even if some people were initially motivated by that, their motivation diminishes quickly. They can't stay at that level, and a lot of people are just turned off by it because it feels overwhelming. Well, then how am I going to? I've got my own problems to solve. Don't give me a handful of others. So hope, yeah, lead with hope. Well, I'll just say I've chatted the playbook again. There's no shame in borrowing, stealing, utilizing this playbook. It is there for the public to use. Narrative cannot be done by any one organization by itself. Narrative change, narrative shift, that is one of the big lessons I have learned in my career, is that we all have to do it together, even though we are competing for funds and other things. One of the things that we have to do is try to figure out how we're kind of speaking with the same voice. Feel free to use that. And thanks to the folks who've created it, and all the hard work went into making that happen. Yes, seeing that there's interest in participating in a training for the playbook. So Alina, I'll let you lead with that. Thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks to you all for the participation. And I guess we're closing out our panel and Housing California. I think this is the last of it. Access is needed. Okay. I'm going to let someone else deal with that technical problem. Our information is, I think, on the app for the Housing California Conference. So if you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to the lovely panelists, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Jennifer.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.